Good morning. Thank you for listening to WXOX 97.1 FM in Louisville, Kentucky, or artxfm.com if you are streaming or on the handy dandy free app. This is Artist Talk with LVA. My name is Keith Waits. I'm your host, and the show is produced by Louisville Visual Art. But we're talking today about an exhibit it's not an annual exhibit, it's a triennial exhibit at the KMAC, and the 2002 KMAC Triennial, Divided We Fall, connects concerns relevant to our geographic region with issues that define the larger national narrative, revealing how our landscape can be a site of conflict and resistance, as well as a place of unity and mutual respect. So that is right about the moment we're experiencing. It features work by Tammy Burke, John Cherry, Sierra Evans, J. Daniel Graham, Ed Hamilton, Bruce Lynn, Ebony G. Patterson, Jose Manuel Nopales Prieto, Hannah Smith, Norman Spencer, and Vadis Turner. The exhibit is open now and will be up through November the 6th, 2022. Today, I am happy to have two of those artists with me. J. Daniel Graham comes from a family of storytellers. His mother was a basket maker and calligrapher, and he learned the lessons of engineering and risk from his father. He studied printmaking at the University of Florida and the University of Georgia, where he earned his master's degree. He also trained as a custom woodworker under woodworker Dennis Sitka in Washington, D.C. Currently, he is a professor of art and chair of the art department at Georgetown College in Georgetown, Kentucky, where he teaches a variety of courses, including sculpture, printmaking, 3D design, metal casting, and package design. His website is jdgraham.net. If you're curious, you might peruse that while we're talking. Also, here is Hannah Smith, who graduated with an MFA from the School of Art and Visual Studies at the University of Kentucky. They are currently teaching graphic design, printmaking, and sculpture at the University of Kentucky and Northern Kentucky University. And they are also a lead teaching artist with Artworks Cincinnati. And Smith, I love these long people that are busy and do lots of stuff. I love it. Smith is also an instructor with the Governor's School for the Arts in Kentucky, and she was honored at the 2022 Future Art Awards Ecosystem X from Mosaic Philanthropy in Los Angeles, California. There's actually a lot of sort of residencies and stuff on her record. You can find out more about that by going to hannahsmithfineart.com. It is, it's always a tricky thing. I've said this before. I should stop saying it to being redundant. You guys have such good biographies and such long resumes. It's like I could do these long things, but it's really more important that we get down to listening to you talk about your work. So let's start with you, Daniel. And my basic question is that how we get the ball rolling is, so you're one of many artists in the KMAC Triennial. Talk to us a little bit about the work you have in this exhibit. Either describe it or maybe just, if you don't want to describe it, say what it is you'd like people to know before they come.
Well, I think the work in the exhibit is an interesting kind of representation of what I do usually. The work is a combination of traditional style of woodworking and more contemporary conceptual sculpture. And so there are a number of pieces in the show. A couple of them are derived from more or less, not to say the theme of the show, but the driving force of the show. And for me, a lot of my ideas come from personal narratives or personal experiences. And I'm not originally from Kentucky. I grew up in a military family, like you said, and I kind of moved around my whole life. And so kind of being from Kentucky now, I have a different view of it than I did before. I jokingly say, like, I only stopped here for gas before I got a job here in Kentucky. And I had a number of peers and colleagues that would make fun of me for coming to Kentucky. And I kind of held that against them. I thought that was really rude, but not anymore, obviously. But I thought it was kind of odd. And a lot of people have a misconception about this part of our world. And so the work kind of addresses some of those things. When you walk into the KMAC exhibit, the Triennial, you're kind of greeted by two of my works, one of which is a response to the flooding in Eastern Kentucky. And then the other are these large 11-foot tall deer on stilts. Well, the deer are only about 2 feet tall, but the stilts are almost 11 feet tall. And so you have this kind of interesting dynamic of seeing nature above you, kind of disregarding you and going about their daily life as they adjust to a kind of a new normal. The other work in the show is a traditionally made shaker cabinet. It's a sewing table from the shaker community, and it's made with no electricity. It's all traditionally hand done, hand cut, everything. And but it's growing fungus. It's growing out of a large mound of dirt. And so it kind of stems from when I had little kids, and my kids are not so little right now, but we would go for hikes all the time. And you'd see these trees that had fallen over and they're kind of degrading and falling apart, but you can see new life coming up out of them. And I feel like Kentucky has a lot of that history, that people have this motion towards more simple ways of living, or a cleaner lifestyle, or more sustainable life. And we look back on the way, not the religious aspect, but the way that the Shakers lived matches up really well with what a lot of people really want. And you see that coming back into the world. And so I thought that was a nice kind of nod to our own little region, and how we kind of respond to it.
And when you say that there was no electricity involved in
Right.
making the shaker cabinet, is that true for all your work, or was that just something you applied to how you approached that piece?
No, most of I don't know. It's kind of a mix. It depends on where the project is and what really needs to go into it. I believe that there's an element of time that people can feel, and so when things are made intentionally and by hand, I oftentimes feel like you can feel something that reverberates out of it. And as a furniture maker, it depends on budget and time. But as an instrument maker, I make a lot of instruments as well. I make banjos and violins and such. And you can feel the presence of time in those objects that you don't feel in something that's mass produced. And so whether it's tools that I make for myself or my tool cabinets, things that I'm going to be around a lot, that's important to me. But if it's something I'm making for somebody that doesn't have the time or money for that, then I don't mind using power tools. It's not a big deal. So it's not like a conceptual or an ethics based thing. But it's nice. I really enjoy it, and I like putting the time in. But for this one specifically, I think it's important because if I just bought an IKEA cabinet that was similar and buried it in dirt, it wouldn't have the same presence or the same kind of feel to me. And if nobody else gets that, that's totally fine. You know, in a lot of my work, people will drift over maybe the details that I find really important, and I'm okay with that, you know, because they're usually there for me.
Interesting. So, and just to clarify, so the relationship of the boats to the flooding in eastern Kentucky is quite clear. Were the deer also a response to that? Is that the idea of the stilts?
No, the stilts came very early on, before the flood stuff in Kentucky, and it was a really interesting kind of notion that they're based out of an odd little piece of history that's well known to a lot of people. It's not like a weird niche secret or something. In France, there was this area that was given to a group of shepherds, and it was seen as like unusable land, or because it's marshy, it wasn't really optimal. And so they grew this culture of walking on stilts as shepherds. And so they would walk on these large stilts, tending to their flocks and moving sheep from here to there. And to this day, you can go, and just like we have like Amish communities, they still have people that will reenact or have this way of walking on stilts for a living. And I was kind of inspired by that idea that Kentucky was kind of seen as this. And I talked with Joey Yates, the curator of the show, about this. Originally, when they were talking to me about the show, the direction of it was much more about kind of, not to say the darker side, but this underlying view of Kentucky. And a lot of people think Kentucky is this wasteland, and not as much today, but even back then, it's called the wilderness, right? You know, people would just say past this certain line, it's a place where you go hunt or fight, but not live. It's just out there. And so I like that idea that the deer and nature and us kind of as the deer and these adolescent deer have taken to adapting ways of using this land for ourselves, you know? So that's where the stilts come from.
Well, the outsider's attitude towards Kentucky, you'd like to think that people aren't like this, but I remember somebody I was in school with who moved here from New York, and you know, she told me people were actually asking me, were you going to have like indoor plumbing in your house? And you know, I don't know if that was just because they wanted to thought they were being funny. She said they weren't. They were actually wondering about it because they were immediately picturing you're in the holler, not in Louisville or Lexington. So.
Well, I know when I took this job here, I told people, I was like, I got this job. I'm right out of grad school. I got this awesome position at Georgetown College. I said, it's in Georgetown, Kentucky. And they're like, where's that? I'm like, well, it's about an hour from Cincinnati, you know, 20 minutes from Louisville. They're like, no, where's Kentucky? Like, you know, they would make this joke about it. And I'd laugh, you know, a little bit and like, oh yeah, whatever. But then it was really funny about 10 years after living here, I kind of felt like I was kind of from here now. And I had this weird itch, and I don't know where this came from. It was something, I don't know where I got something, but I was like, well, if I'm kind of from here, I should at least know how to play a song or two on a banjo. Like that seemed natural, right? And then I had to laugh because I made a banjo to learn a couple songs. And then I couldn't find anybody to play banjo. I was like, why did I think that being from Kentucky, I should play a banjo? And then I started finding out these great communities and really, really rich cultural history of those instruments around here. And it was a really unique thing. And I kind of struggled with it, honestly. Like when I was first here, not say I was ashamed in any ways, but when I would say I was from Kentucky now, artists would dismiss you, and it's like, I've lived in DC, I've been through New York, I've done all that stuff. And when you say, oh yeah, I live in Kentucky, they're like, oh, and it's kind of this weird thing. I don't know if Hannah has this experience.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And so it was an odd thing, but if you play the banjo, people want to be from Kentucky. If you're on the Tennessee-Kentucky border and you play banjo, you say you're from Kentucky because it gives you more like musician kind of stuff, And so it was very odd that I was like, why in one realm and community it's this pride, and the other it's this kind of abashed thing for other people as an artist. So,
yeah. Well, Hannah, you've been very, very patient. Daniel's obviously a talker. Let's see if you're a talker.
I'm not as much.
Talk about your work. It's interesting because I think that your medium is in a stark contrast to Daniel, but I think thematically you guys, maybe there's a real relationship there. Talk about the work your work. It's an installation piece. Talk about that.
Right. I definitely see what you're saying about some kind of conceptual through lines. So my piece for the KMAC is titled Big Gulp, which is like a nod to the Speedway drink. And it features like this big thermoformed plastic. I call it a machine. I was really inspired by and thinking about sort of sci-fi machinery as this larger symbol for like exploitation of the working class. And it's kind of, well, I'll get there, I guess, but what you'll see beyond that is a snake coming out of the wall, and then kind of these wall tumors that are an extension of the snake, sort of around the installation space. And then finally, little LED miniature signage pieces coming out of those tumors or snake body parts. So to talk a little bit about why I'm featuring this snake creature, I also want to mention one of Daniel's points about sort of the theme of the show, or sort of the earlier inception of the show, being about, well, so the history of Kentucky being sort of thought of as dark and bloody ground was something that was brought up in our initial conversation. So that got me thinking about like the Native American lineages in the surrounding area in Kentucky, and sort of wanting to acknowledge that this land was stolen by Native Americans, or this was battleground areas. Where I live now in Cincinnati actually was stolen by Native Americans. And there are many burial mounds, like Serpent Mound specifically, which served as sort of the inception point of the snake as this larger symbol of like corporate greed, and acknowledging things that were lost for the sake of exploitation of the land and working class. So I was sort of, and it's interesting to hear how we both heard this original sort of conception of the show and ran in totally opposite directions of it. I'm like, yeah, the land's being exploited and destroyed. And Daniel's like, yeah, the land is beautiful. Which it is, yes. But I was also thinking a lot about and listening a lot to John Prine while making this piece. So you'll see a lot of references to his lyrics, and sort of references to Kentucky's coal mining industry, sort of history. And yeah, that's kind of a lot. I know I am a talker, I guess.
No, that's, hey, if you're not a talker, what a terrible thing for you to have you on a radio show.
Yeah.
I've had people who are monosyllabic, and it's, they're good people, but they're not good radio guests. But it's interesting. You talk about, you're differentiating lands stolen from Native Americans, but I guess my response to that is, what part of North America or in what part of the United States wasn't stolen? Like,
right. Yes, I think that's
it's really, yeah, it's
right.
it's just everywhere. And There may be some particularly egregious sort of incidents and things we find in the history, but we're all walking on that ground, and
Right.
need to be reminded of that all the time, but not to be preachifying. But so although, hey, you're the host of a radio show, you get to do that sometimes. So but it's interesting what you're talking about, how those things emerge. But I mean, I think that's what a curator's job is, right? To come up with a theme to put to a group of artists, or an idea or a concept, and then what they all do can be entirely different and
Mm.
seem at a glance unrelated, you know. And I don't know that that's true. I think the theme, you see the theme in most of the work, even at Hamilton's pieces that are older pieces. I don't there was nothing new brought into the mix here, but they seem to represent, they seem to tie into the theme very well too. Um, no, I know you. So you do a lot of installation work. We'll stay with you for a second here and get back to Daniel. But you do a lot of installation work. But do you but when I look at your website and review some of the work you've done in the past, I see things that are a lot of bright color that are
Yeah.
lit in a gallery, and then these other times, like in this example, where you go into having something that needs to almost be in a room, a dark room, where and I went in to look at it, and I wanted to spend more time there, but I got to tell you, the moment that I picked to walk in there, there was a crowd in there. Like there was it was a little bit of a, like, well, I thought I'll come back around, because I can't really kind of sit and spend a lot of time examining it. And it is very complex. It is, there's a lot of detail and small little things happening. And I could get that from even a brief time looking at it. Um, what moves you in one direction or the other? Or are you right now doing more of those kinds of lit installations, lighted installation?
Well, it's funny that you should mention that actually. I really see my practice moving more towards kind of smaller scale, discrete sculpture pieces that are sort of installed in unique ways. And I think this installation was a lot of smaller experiments that turned into an installation. So I definitely see this work being like a springboard for a million other smaller pieces, if that makes sense. But to talk to your point about like color and sort of how this work maybe existed in a darker kind of space than a lot of my previous work. I actually started doing this at Georgetown College's gallery. I think maybe the first installation I was playing around with really, really dim lighting in was there. And for me, I think it kind of sets this more ominous theatrical kind of vibe, like I talk about sci-fi being an inspiration for my work, and that's definitely where this is coming from. Sort of setting the scene that like, while these are recognizable miniature objects and it feels kind of like a diorama, there's something a little bit more sinister going on here. So sort of like begging you to dig a little bit to a darker layer behind these banal things.
Well, and it definitely had a little bit of, I mean, as you say that, I'm thinking like, well, like Blade Runner, right? That sort of
Exactly, Blake.
dense,
Yeah.
neon lit sort of urban environment, that it seems like and also it's interesting because you're talking about you're in the room where normally in most exhibits or whatever, if there is such a thing, they would be projecting a film or a video. So
Yeah.
that cinematic connection is sort of, it's all exactly right, it seems like.
Yeah, I definitely think it makes a lot of sense for that work to be in that space. Yeah.
Well, Daniel, let's come back to you. We'll keep the ball rolling around a little bit. So when you're in Georgetown, which, and we were talking about the sort of attitudes towards Kentucky and things like that. And I think, to me, it's like you talk about, well, there's the University of Louisville, there's the University of Kentucky, there's Northern Kentucky University, there's Georgetown, there's the University of Kentucky, that all have a lot of good creative energy, good departments and different ways and everything. Why did you settle in, was Georgetown, when you talk about you came to Kentucky and stopped for gas, was Georgetown just a job that came up because you were in Kentucky, or were you looking to be, it's not that it's out in the wilderness, but that is a little bit off. It's a smaller community and a little bit off the beaten track.
Yeah, when I first, short story long, I applied for a ton of jobs when I was leaving graduate school, and I got a number of job offers and whatnot. But this one I connected with really well, and the people were really interesting, and it was kind of this odd place that I couldn't get away from. Like when I did the interview, I felt like it just crashed and burned, and they called me back, and I was like, cool. And then I came and did a guest lecture and exhibition stuff, and I remember just like going off the rails for a while because I'm an ADD kind of guy. And I told my wife, I called her, I said, hey, we kind of blew that one because I went on a 5-minute rant about, catapults and hamsters. And she was like, okay, we got more. And I was like, cool. And then they called me back. We're like, we're excited for you to be here. And I was like, if they want me as me, that's more exciting than the other places, And so I ended up taking the job here. And I remember looking the provost in the face when she introduced Saul, and then we had this like orientation. She's like, I hope you guys retire here. And I was like, yeah, that sounds great. And I thought I'd be here for like a year and a half or 2 years, move on to a bigger institution. And that was always the plan. And something got in the water and in my blood. And we've loved it here. And it's been really interesting. So I've been here now, I'm going on 17 years. I've been here 16 years now.
Wow. Well, it sort of begs the question, I remember, when I was looking at schools and going to art school, and the question that young people are faced with, like, is it better to go to, I always wanted to go to a smaller program. I didn't want to go get into a big university program. But here we've got, and Hannah is teaching in maybe both circumstances, but what's your feeling about, is there more value in studying art in a smaller institution? And Georgetown's not, again, I don't mean to be, but it's not the mega university sort of program.
It's a totally different direction also. It's a liberal arts school primarily. And so like, I always say this when I was being interviewed here, and they said, you went from Washington, DC, University of Florida, University of Georgia, big schools, big programs. Why are you here? And that was a hard question for me to answer. And my initial answer was like, I was in the Boy Scouts. Like I had no like real repercussion for it. But honestly, the thing that I said was, I kind of went to a small school in a big school. And I don't know if Hannah had this same experience, but like at the University of Florida where I was one of like a few thousand art majors. Mm-hmm. And, but I was a printmaker. So I had 2 art faculty basically that were my main studying people. And there was only like 13 of us, right, in the printmaking program. And so when I came here, it felt very natural because we have like 4 art faculty. We have about 30 or 40 majors, give or take a little more. But we're a small school. It's the same kind of proportion as a bigger school, but it's just housed in that way. So I don't think I ever met, business people and whatever at University of Florida. It was all art people. And so it felt like a small community housed in a big school. So they felt very similar to me. So it felt kind of natural.
Well, Hannah, what about you? Because you're connected right now to both the University of Kentucky and Northern Kentucky, but you're also teaching at Artworks, and you've taught at the Art Academy of Cincinnati, and of course GSA is a whole nother experience with younger kids. Yeah. Like, what's your take on the small program? And is it that our art departments and universities, do they tend to have that kind of feeling because it's the nature of artists versus people who are exploring engineering or business or whatever, that they because I've often thought this, but I didn't go to a large program, that they make that community because it's just something sort of inherent in their character?
Well, it's funny that you should ask that, because I definitely feel that like the strictly art school experience has been a lot less corporate or rigid feeling to my experiences working at NKU and UK. Not to say that I prefer one necessarily over the other, but it's just like interesting to acknowledge those differences even within teaching the same class. The expectations will be very different. And as for a sense of community, I choosing my words carefully here. I feel like I definitely noticed a sort of heightened sense of community among the artists at my larger schools that I've worked within, and maybe a little bit more competitiveness at the smaller art schools strictly.
Mhm.
And I also have one kind of unrelated note here. Daniel talking about being or going to University of Florida. I weirdly know a lot of Kentucky artists or artists working and living in Kentucky now that went to University of Florida. So really strange connection, I think.
Weird big school. I run into that a lot with, and I was there in the 90s. And so like, I have people that will have an exhibition here and they're like, oh, I went to UF. I'm like, oh, cool. And they're like, we have nobody in common, no, whatever else is. But I will tell you, the University of Florida Foundations program had this drastic changeover right before I came there. And I did not go to school for art originally. I went to school for something completely unrelated. I was kind of denying that I should be in the arts for a while, kind of thing. And but there was a huge changeover to this very, very highly conceptual foundational program called WARP. And it was led by someone named Monica Lidman, who's one of my heroes. She's still one of my good friends today. But that program alone, when you go to conferences or meet people, they either have come from that program or they base their foundational stuff off of that program.
Huh.
It was so, and we could talk about it later, even outside this interview.
Yeah.
I don't want to bore listeners, but it was so revolutionary to how art was taught in general places that it kind of changed a lot of the way things were taught. And so you see that kind of trickling through a lot of places. So I think the people that are successful have been in a program like that or from that program.
That's really interesting to think about. I'd love to pick your brain about that more after this.
For sure. It was wild. And especially for me, like as an 18-year-old kid going in there, it was something I never experienced before. It's a super immersive program. It's a 9 credit hour class is the only class you're allowed to take. And so even if you just wanted to take like ceramics for leisure or just drawing, you have to take this one 9 credit hour conceptual course first. And it was really, really crazy. It was cool.
Nice.
That's interesting. You should don't be afraid to have talked about that. And I understand, but I understand you and Hannah will go talk about this maybe more later. So let's get back to the Triennial a little bit. So this is not a juried show, right? This is a selection. Probably because of your locations, my guess is Joe Yates knew of your work. I mean, you weren't brand new to him. But what's the process like? Did he come and spend time talking to you? Did he come? Was it all about studio visits, or was it just like, I want this in the show?
Well, for me, we had a studio visit. I had been pestering him for a long time, trying to show him my work after my MFA thesis show was up. And we just like kept missing each other, it's like email tag, phone tag, all that game. And then he hit me up last January for a studio visit saying that he had a project in mind for my work. So that's sort of how it happened for me.
And so your installation was built specifically for the Triennial?
Yes, it was.
Do you think you would have built that installation? Would you have gotten to that idea and that concept without the Triennial invitation?
That's challenging. I think I would have come to something similar because I filtered my ideas through where I wanted my practice to head, like how I wanted to sort of challenge my practice to change after I graduated. And it concerns a lot of similar things that my practice already did, like capitalism, exploitation, things like that. But I do think it caused me to pursue different avenues of research that I think informed the work in ways that it may not have ever sort of had the chance to without this invitation.
Okay. And Daniel, what about you? How did the process go for you?
It worked interestingly similar, but I've had a number of conversations with Joey before through exhibitions and openings and stuff. And but in 2018, through the Great Meadows Foundations, they had a curator and critic, Dan Cameron from New York. Right. Yeah, he came, and they asked if he would want to come to my shop and my studio to give me a studio visit as part of this program. And so I was like, I have no idea who this guy is. I'm like in my own little bubble sometimes here. And he came, and we had these awesome arguments. Like, we got into some really great debates about just what you call a hammer for like 45 minutes. I mean, it was just really awesome. And real story. And so it was really a good conversation, but it was slightly tense because I was like, I don't know who this guy is. And so I would just say what I thought. He's like, this is really refreshing. And so we had this really, really weird rapport. And so apparently Joey had contacted Dan and said, is there anybody that comes to mind that represents the state really well? And he was like, well, there's this guy that we argued about a hammer, like, and so he put my name forward, I think. And so Joey reached out to me about being in the Triennial. And he said, here's kind of the theme that we're working for. And I said, well, this is great. I just finished off this whole body of work. And it would be great for this. I could put it in the show. And he was like, no, the work has to be kind of specific for the show. And I was like, oh, okay. So I floated some ideas by him. And he said, that sounds really good. And so I spent the summer, making the work for the show pretty much. And so then he came for a studio visit in the middle of it. And we talked through a bunch of it, but yeah, it's a really interesting process because I've worked with a couple of museum shows before, and they're all different. Depends on the curator, depends on the staff. Galleries obviously work different in the museum world, but it was really nice and personable working with them and their staff. And so he'd show up or we'd talk, and yeah.
Well, it's interesting your story about Dan Cameron. I had him on the show too, and spent some time with him, and he was very interesting. It doesn't surprise me at all that you argued about the hammer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm making tools out of body parts. I had these like hammers that are based off of they're made out of my fingers.
Mhm.
And so he was like, here, I got one. Over here. So it's like my ring finger. It's an actual hammer.
Wow.
So I use them for their plane adjusting hammers, and they're bronze cast hammers. They're like soft metals. And I got really weird responses. I got contacted by woodworkers that had lost fingers, and they wanted to buy it for their friends or whatever. And so I got these pictures from all the world of people getting replacement fingers, But anyways, he was like, this is an art object. I was like, no, this is a functional object. And he was like, no. I said, well, you can use it. Like, so somebody can put it on a pedestal or use it in your shop. And so it depends on their context of it. And so that's what we got an argument about or discussion about. And it was great. But yeah.
Well, there's a real tension about functional, non-functional, or what.
Right.
I'm a big believer. This maybe seem like a mundane observation, but we're having some renovations at Louisville Visual Art, and they dug the trenches for the plumbing, and there's this great PVC construction that was just sitting in the trench. And I went over there and I was looking at it, and I said, that's really cool looking. And you're about to pour concrete on it, and I will never see that again. But there's something about that and this symmetry, and it's just strictly a functional thing. But we don't see it like that. It's inside of the walls. It's under the floor. It's like, I don't know. I sort of love making those kinds of observations, but there's absolutely no attempt by anybody involved in that process to make an aesthetic piece or a creative or artistic piece. It all goes a certain way because it has to go a certain way. It was still beautiful. But so, well, let me throw this at you. So we've spent a good time talking with both of you, and besides each other, what other artists Daniel, since we're talking to you, what other artists in the Triennial were you most excited to see what the work would be? And not to make any sort of qualitative judgment, but who were you excited to see their work?
Well, do you know what's odd was, and I don't know about Hannah's experience, but I didn't know who was in it until, you did?
I did, yeah. Sorry,
I
go
had no
on.
idea. I literally, my wife is having a solo exhibition. My kids have all their camp stuff. I'm trying to teach through the summer. I'm doing custom jobs. I was like, cool, we're in a show. I'm going to go put this in there. And it was very, I was really sucked into what I was doing. And so I knew that John was in there, and I knew that, who else was in there? I can't remember her name. The one that did the quilts with resin. Can't remember her last name.
Oh,
Is that Tammy Burke? Wait,
No.
no,
It's the last person.
Vadis.
Yeah.
Addis Turner.
Yeah. So I knew she was in the show. And that was kind of it. And so when I went to the opening, I was really excited to see who was there. And so when I saw Hannah's work, I was like, oh, Hannah's in the show. And like, you know, I was like, oh, they're in the show. You know, I had no idea. And a lot of people I didn't know, honestly. And so that was really exciting to get to meet some new people and be exposed to what they do. So.
Well, Hannah, same question to you. Who were you most excited about seeing?
Okay, well, so the only reason I knew who was in it was because one of my really good friends works at the KMAC, and she's also writes for Ruckus.
Mhm.
And they asked me to do a Rizzo print for them last month for their Patreon subscribers. So while she was dropping off the check for me, she was like, hey, by the way, do you know who's in this show? I had no idea who was in it. But anyway, I was really excited and kind of intimidated to hear that Ed Hamilton was going to be in there and Ebony Patterson was going to be in there. Really excited because, okay, especially Ed Hamilton growing up in Louisville is just iconic.
Right.
But also Ebony Patterson, she worked at the institution where I got my MFA, but it was a few years before I had entered the program. So there's just sort of like a ghost of her roaming the hallways, and, you know, just like the echoes of like how prolific she is as an artist. I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that I'm going to be in a show with this person. It was so exciting. And to see the work that she put in there was equally exciting because I'm also a pretty big toy nerd and she used a lot of toys. So yeah, it was just cool.
Did you get to meet her and talk to her, or had you ever met her before?
No, I've never met, still haven't met. Maybe one day.
Was she at the opening? I don't, because I did
No,
not.
she wasn't there.
No.
I know that Ed Hamilton was. Did you get a chance to talk to Ed Hamilton?
No, I was too intimidated.
Oh, well, listen, Ed is like the most easygoing guy.
I'm sure he is.
He really, really is. He's not at all intimidating, and which is great because I think he completely understands who he is and his status and his position. But I've always appreciated about him that he stayed in Louisville when I think he, you know, whatever, you become a famous artist, you could go live in whatever, New York or whatever. But he has stayed in residence on the west side of Louisville and really stayed true to those kinds of his roots, and has always been very good with Louisville Visual Art. He was actually a children's fine art class student when he was a young.
Oh, no way.
Yes, he was.
So was I, by the way.
Oh, you were CFAC too? Oh, okay.
Yes. Yes.
Well, I was going to ask you. You said you grew up in Louisville, and I wondered where you went to school and stuff in terms of your high school. And
Well, I went to North Oldham High School, so it's like just 20 minutes outside the city. But my CFAC classes, I was studying under Dennis Whitehouse for quite a few years. Yeah, and my mom actually also worked for LVA for a little bit. Shout out Jean Smith. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I might have missed her. I worked 2 years in the 80s, and then I came back in 2006. Probably.
Oh, okay.
Wow, I didn't realize you had such history with LVA. That's so cool.
Pretty deep. Yeah.
Remember, I was telling you before we started this interview, a sense of discovery is what makes the show so much fun for me, and that's exactly look what we just discovered.
That I can provide.
No, Ed is a wonderful guy. You should if you ever get a chance to meet him and talk to him at all, you should step up and do it because he's really he's very funny. Of course, he's very dapper. He always looks, you know.
Oh yeah, I saw the hat. The whole
Yeah,
it's just amazing.
well, I was across the street at Mormon Gallery, and I came over, and he was standing on the sidewalk, and I said, "You stand there, you're like a beacon. You're just drawing people's energy over here to KMAC tonight," because he's like that. So yeah. Okay, well, cool. Well, I just, I always think it's nice. It's hard, when the subject of the show is our show is an exhibit with this many people in it. I really can't get too many people. I mean, and I think like 2 or 3 people is about, I think, a good conversation for the guests. So I always do like to ask people to talk about the other artists, so we give a little attention to them. So I appreciate you taking the time to do that. So what's coming up next, Hannah? What's coming up next for you? Do you have any big? Are you show or something you're involved in?
So I've got a few things going on right now. So I'm the lead teaching artist for Artworks Next Mural, which is going up at Cincinnati State's, and now forget the name of the exact building, but it's something like the Advanced Technology Center or something like that.
Mhm.
And then I'm going to be participating or tabling at Cincinnati, the Zine Fest in Cincinnati with Claire Kruger, also a Louisville
Oh, yeah.
native. Yeah.
She does a lot of work for us, and she's a big zine person. Yeah.
Yeah, she is. The last thing I got going on is in November, dates still TBD. I'm going to be showing at an artist run space in Cincinnati called Rainbow, led by Ian Hursko. So yeah.
Cool. Well, and Daniel, what about you?
Well, classes are full in session for what we got going on right now. And so usually my practice is summer and then my ADD moments throughout the year. But I have 2 exhibitions coming up and some custom work for folks. But the main one I'm working towards now is next summer. I have an exhibition at the City Gallery in downtown Lexington, and it's a collaborative exhibition with Ben Mason, who's a phenomenal luthier. And so we're kind of doing an instrument art show. It's kind of an interesting situation. So that should be really fun.
So I hope, well, if you're doing an instrument art show, I hope there's some music going on with that.
There will be. That's the really interesting part of us. Part of it is that we'll be having a number of music events and venues. So everything from traditional chamber music to old time fiddle tunes, and people don't bring their instruments; they just pick off the wall and play.
Oh,
for the-
cool.
Really?
That's
Yeah,
awesome.
everything's fully
wow.
playable and whatever. So it'll be really interesting to see. We'll have 3 or 4 different live music events, and depending upon which one you hit, you'll hear those instruments played completely differently.
Wow.
Very
That's-
cool.
I didn't think you'd go that far. I think that's wonderful. I think that's so cool that you're doing that. Yeah. But again, the musical instruments being an exact example of the sort of form and function, sort of the, I mean, I've often just thought, I just want to buy like a Les Paul and put it on the wall. I couldn't begin to play it, but I just think it's so beautiful. I just want to hang it on the
Right.
wall. Or
And a lot of people exist in that space, and it's always funny. It's like I walk on that line in almost everything I do, and that's a whole other conversation. But I think it is interesting that a lot of people, depending upon how they view it or how they use it, changes its context really, by definition. So
yeah. Well, cool. Well, you guys were so much fun. Thank you so much for taking the time. We were just talking to J. Daniel Graham and Hannah Smith, and they are in the KMAC Triennial, which is up right now at Kentucky Museum of Art and Craft in Louisville, Kentucky, and it runs through, just check my date, November the 6th of this year. So lots of other people, and again, just to be good about it, also besides Daniel and Hannah, Tammy Burke, John Cherry, Sierra Evans, Ed Hamilton, Bruce Lynn, Ebony G. Patterson, Jose Manuel Nepalese Prieto, I hope I'm saying that right, Norman Spencer, and Vadis Turner. So plenty to look at in this exhibit, plenty to look, probably worth maybe more than one visit would be how I would look at it, but who knows. So thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Hannah, for being with me today.
Thanks for having
Thank
me.
you. Thank you.